The security guard's hand was already on her shoulder when Sarah heard the familiar sound of expensive leather shoes clicking against marble floors. She looked up from the hospital waiting room chair where she'd been sitting for 6 hours, her worn jacket clutched tightly around her shoulders, to see a figure that made her heart stop. But that was impossible. Her son Marcus was supposed to be in Tokyo, closing a merger deal, not standing in the lobby of Chicago's most prestigious medical center wearing a look that could freeze hell itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Williams had perfected the art of being invisible. At 52, she moved through the world like a shadow, her graying hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes carefully chosen from clearance racks to avoid drawing attention. To most people who passed her on the street, she was just another middle-aged woman working a thankless job, barely scraping by in a city that had no patience for people like her. What they didn't see was the fierce intelligence behind her tired eyes, or the way she could solve complex problems that left others stumped. They certainly didn't know that the woman cleaning their office buildings at night had raised one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, or that she'd sacrificed everything to make sure her son had opportunities she'd never dreamed of. For 28 years, Sarah had worked as a night janitor at various office complexes throughout Chicago. She'd started when Marcus was just 2 years old, after her husband left them with nothing but a pile of unpaid bills and a broken promise that he'd be back. Those early years were a blur of exhaustion, surviving on 3 hours of sleep between her cleaning shifts and taking care of a toddler who seemed to absorb knowledge like a sponge. Even as a child, Marcus was different. While other kids played with toys, he was building complex structures out of cardboard boxes and asking questions that made Sarah's head spin. She'd find him at the kitchen table at dawn, having stayed up all night reading books from the library that were meant for children twice his age. The teachers called him gifted, but gifted didn't pay for rent or groceries or the second-hand clothes that Marcus outgrew faster than Sarah could replace them. Sarah worked doubles whenever she could, sometimes cleaning 3 different buildings in a single night, just to afford the tutoring that Marcus needed to stay ahead. She learned to survive on coffee and determination, watching her son excel in accelerated programs while she scrubbed toilets and emptied trash cans in the same buildings where people made more in a month than she did in a year. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the way her knees ached from kneeling on cold floors for hours. It was the way people looked through her, as if she didn't exist. Executives would have entire conversations about confidential business deals while she cleaned around them, never considering that the woman wiping down their conference table might be listening, might understand every word they were saying. They saw the uniform and the cleaning cart, and their brains simply edited her out of their reality. Marcus never knew how close they came to losing everything. When he was 14 and accepted into an elite private school on a full academic scholarship, Sarah didn't tell him that she'd taken out loans against their tiny apartment to buy him the laptop he needed for his advanced computer programming classes. When he got into MIT with a full ride, she didn't mention that she'd been working 7 days a week for months to save money for his textbooks and living expenses that the scholarship didn't cover. She kept her struggles hidden because she wanted her son to reach for the stars without worrying about the ground beneath his feet. Every night while she worked, Sarah would picture Marcus in lecture halls and laboratories, absorbing knowledge and building the future she'd never been able to imagine for herself. It made the aching in her back and the exhaustion in her bones feel like a small price to pay. During Marcus's college years, their phone calls became less frequent. He was busy with internships and research projects, making connections with classmates whose families had summer homes in the Hamptons. Sarah understood that he was building a life in a world she'd never be part of, and she was proud of that. She wanted him to belong somewhere better than the place they'd started. After graduation, Marcus moved to California to work for a tech startup that Sarah had never heard of, but that apparently paid more money than she could comprehend. Their conversations became brief updates, holiday cards, and the occasional check that Marcus would send with notes telling her to treat herself to something nice. Sarah never cashed those checks. Instead, she kept them in a shoebox under her bed, proof that somewhere out there her son was living the life she'd dreamed for him. What Sarah didn't know was that the startup had been acquired by a larger company, which was then bought by an even larger corporation, and that Marcus had leveraged his stock options and technical expertise into a series of investments that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. She didn't know that the brief, polite phone calls were Marcus's way of compartmentalizing his past, of keeping his current life separate from the memories of their tiny apartment and her second-hand clothes. Marcus had built an empire on the foundation his mother had given him, but somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that acknowledging where he came from would somehow diminish what he'd achieved. He'd created a new identity for himself in Silicon Valley, with a carefully crafted backstory that glossed over the years when dinner was often just peanut butter sandwiches because it was all they could afford.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The truth was that Marcus loved his mother more than anything in the world, but he'd also become terrified of her world. He'd worked so hard to escape the limitations of poverty that he'd forgotten the strength it had taught him. In his gleaming corporate offices, surrounded by people who'd never known real struggle, it was easier to pretend that he'd always belonged in boardrooms and luxury hotels. Sarah, meanwhile, had accepted that this was how things were meant to be. She was proud of what Marcus had accomplished, even if she felt like she was watching his success from a great distance. She'd done her job as a mother, launching him into a life where he'd never have to worry about money or scrape together rent payment. The fact that this life didn't seem to have room for her was a sacrifice she was willing to make. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah was finishing her shift at the Meridian Tower, the newest and most expensive office building on her route, when she felt a sharp pain in her chest that took her breath away. She leaned against her cleaning cart, waiting for it to pass, but the pain only got worse. By the time she made it to the employee break room, she was struggling to breathe and her left arm felt like it was on fire. The security guard who found her 20 minutes later said later that she was lucky to be alive. The paramedics rushed her to Chicago General, the public hospital where people without insurance went when they couldn't afford to go anywhere else. Sarah spent 3 days in the cardiac unit, connected to machines that beeped and hummed while doctors spoke in medical terminology that she didn't understand. The cardiologist, a tired-looking resident who barely looked old enough to drive, explained that she'd had a minor heart attack, but that there was evidence of more serious underlying problems. Her arteries were severely blocked, and without surgery, she was looking at another, potentially fatal cardiac event within months. The surgery she needed was complex and expensive, the kind of procedure that required a specialist and weeks of recovery. Sarah listened to the explanation with growing dread, not because she was afraid of dying, but because she knew exactly what came next. The social worker who appeared the following morning confirmed her fears. Sarah's insurance, the basic coverage provided by the cleaning company, would cover emergency treatment, but not the specialized cardiac surgery she needed. The procedure would cost more than $200,000, money that Sarah didn't have and never would have. The social worker, a kind woman named Patricia, who had clearly had this conversation too many times, explained Sarah's options. She could apply for charity care, join a waiting list for reduced-cost procedures, or seek treatment at a public hospital that might be able to help her in 6 months to a year. None of these options sounded like they would keep Sarah alive long enough to matter. That's when Patricia mentioned Westfield Medical Center. It was Chicago's most exclusive private hospital, the place where celebrities and politicians went for treatment. They had one of the best cardiac surgery programs in the country and a world-renowned specialist who could perform the procedure Sarah needed. Of course, Westfield didn't take charity cases or uninsured patients. Their standard policy was to require full payment up front or proof of insurance that covered the entire cost of treatment. Sarah thanked Patricia for the information, knowing that Westfield Medical Center might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do her. She was discharged from Chicago General with a prescription for medication she couldn't afford and instructions to avoid stress and physical exertion, which was impossible when your job involved pushing heavy cleaning carts up and down stairs for 8 hours a night. For 2 weeks, Sarah tried to continue working while she figured out what to do. She applied for every assistance program Patricia had mentioned, filled out forms that asked for information about assets she didn't have and income that barely covered her rent. She researched crowdfunding websites and wondered if anyone would donate money to help a janitor they'd never met pay for heart surgery she might not survive anyway. The worst part was keeping it all from Marcus. During their monthly phone call, she listened to him talk about his latest business acquisition and a conference he was attending in Switzerland, and she made appropriate sounds of interest while her chest ached and her breath came in short gasps. She couldn't bring herself to tell him about the heart attack or the surgery she needed. He'd built such a beautiful life for himself, and she wasn't going to drag him back into the world of medical bills and insurance denials that she'd worked so hard to spare him from. But as the days passed and Sarah felt herself getting weaker, she realized she was running out of options. The medications weren't working and the episodes of chest pain were becoming more frequent and more severe. She was going to have to swallow her pride and ask her son for help, even if it meant revealing just how far apart their worlds had become.
Sarah was still trying to work up the courage to make that phone call when fate intervened in the most humiliating way possible. She was cleaning the executive offices at Meridian Tower when another episode hit, this one stronger than any she'd experienced before. The pain was so intense that she collapsed next to the mahogany conference table where she'd been polishing brass fixtures, her cleaning supplies scattered across the expensive carpet. This time, instead of being taken to Chicago General, the paramedics rushed her to the nearest hospital, which happened to be Westfield Medical Center. Sarah tried to tell them there had been a mistake, that she couldn't afford treatment at a private hospital, but she was barely conscious, and her words came out as gasps and whispers that no one seemed to hear. She woke up in a private room that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital, connected to machines that were newer and quieter than the ones at Chicago General. For a moment, Sarah felt a flutter of hope. Maybe there had been some kind of miracle, some program she didn't know about that would help her get the treatment she needed. That hope died the moment Dr. Victoria Thornton walked into the room. Sarah had never met anyone quite like Dr. Thornton before. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, and clothes that probably cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. Everything about her radiated wealth and privilege, from her designer glasses to the way she moved through the room like she owned not just the hospital, but the entire world. Dr. Thornton was Westfield's chief of cardiac surgery, a woman whose reputation was legendary and whose patient list read like a who's who of Chicago's elite. She'd performed surgery on senators and CEOs, movie stars and foreign dignitaries. She was also, Sarah quickly learned, someone who had very definite ideas about who deserved her expertise and who didn't. Dr. Thornton barely glanced at Sarah as she reviewed the chart, her expression growing colder with each page she turned. When she finally looked up, her pale blue eyes held the kind of disdain that Sarah had spent her entire life trying to avoid. It was the look that said she didn't belong here, that her presence was somehow contaminating a space meant for better people. The conversation that followed was brief and devastating. Dr. Thornton explained in crisp, clinical terms that Sarah needed immediate surgery, that her condition was critical and that without intervention, she would likely die within weeks. Then, in the same emotionless tone, she explained that Westfield Medical Center had strict policies about treating uninsured patients. They would stabilize her condition and then transfer her to a public hospital where she could join the waiting list for surgery. Sarah tried to explain about the program she'd applied for, about the possibility that she might qualify for reduced-cost treatment, but Dr. Thornton cut her off with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. These policies existed for a reason, she said. Westfield couldn't function as a charity organization. They had obligations to their paying patients, to their shareholders, to the standards that made them the premier medical facility in the region. What Dr. Thornton didn't say, but what came through clearly in her tone and her body language, was that people like Sarah simply didn't belong at Westfield. The hospital was meant for individuals who could afford the best care, not for janitors who cleaned other people's offices for minimum wage. Sarah's presence there was an inconvenience, a problem to be solved as quickly and quietly as possible. The humiliation was worse than the physical pain. Sarah had spent her entire adult life being treated as invisible. But this was different. This was being seen and judged and found completely lacking. Dr. Thornton looked at her the way someone might look at a stray dog that had wandered into an expensive restaurant, with a mixture of disgust and impatience.
As Dr. Thornton turned to leave, Sarah made one last desperate attempt to appeal to whatever humanity might exist beneath that polished exterior. She talked about her son, about how proud she was of what he'd achieved, about how she just wanted to live long enough to see him settled and happy. She didn't mention Marcus's success or his wealth, partly because she still didn't fully understand the extent of either, but mostly because she wanted Dr. Thornton to see her as a person, not as a potential source of payment. Dr. Thornton's response was swift and final. Personal circumstances, she said, didn't change medical policies. Westfield Medical Center couldn't make exceptions based on sob stories, no matter how compelling they might be. Sarah would be transferred to Chicago General within the hour, and she should consider herself fortunate that they'd stabilized her condition free of charge. After Dr. Thornton left, Sarah lay in that beautiful hospital room feeling smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. She'd been dismissed not just as a patient, but as a human being, reduced to nothing more than an insurance status and a bank account balance. The machines around her continued to beep softly, monitoring a heart that felt like it was breaking in more ways than one. That's when she finally made the phone call she'd been avoiding for weeks. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar, despite the distance between them. Sarah tried to keep her voice steady as she explained where she was and what had happened, but she couldn't stop the tears that had been building up for weeks from finally spilling over. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was different, colder than she'd ever heard it. He asked for details about her condition, about the surgery she needed, about the doctors who'd been treating her. Sarah answered as best she could, still trying to minimize the severity of the situation because she didn't want to worry him. Marcus told her to stay exactly where she was, that he was coming home and would take care of everything. The certainty in his voice reminded Sarah of the determined little boy who used to insist he could fix anything that was broken. But this wasn't a toy or a homework problem. This was the gap between their two worlds, between who she was and who he'd become. And Sarah wasn't sure even Marcus could bridge that distance. After she hung up, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for the transfer back to Chicago General. She'd done what she could, reached out to the one person who might be able to help her, but she wasn't going to get her hopes up. Even if Marcus had done well for himself, the kind of money needed for treatment at Westfield was beyond anything she could imagine asking from her son. The last thing Sarah expected was to hear those familiar footsteps in the hospital corridor, the confident stride of someone who belonged in places like this. But as she opened her eyes and saw the security guard reaching for her shoulder, preparing to escort her to the transfer wheelchair, she heard a sound that made her heart stop for reasons that had nothing to do with her medical condition. Marcus was home, and from the look on his face as he stood in the doorway of Westfield Medical Center, Dr. Victoria Thornton was about to learn exactly who she'd been so quick to dismiss. Marcus' chin stood in the hospital corridor like a storm waiting to break. The transformation from the boy Sarah remembered to the man before her was startling. Gone was any trace of the uncertainty that had once marked his features. In its place was the kind of confidence that came from wielding real power, the bearing of someone accustomed to having entire boardrooms hang on his every word. Dr. Thornton appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, clearly expecting to supervise Sarah's transfer to the public hospital. She glanced at Marcus with mild curiosity, probably assuming he was another family member here to say goodbye before the patient was moved to more appropriate accommodations. Her expression shifted to barely concealed irritation when Marcus stepped directly into her path. "Excuse me," Thornton said, her voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to being blocked by anyone. "You'll need to step aside. We're transferring this patient, and family visits can resume once she's settled at Chicago General." Marcus didn't move.
Instead, he studied Dr. Thornton with the same intensity he'd once reserved for complex coding problems, taking in every detail of her expensive suit, her perfectly styled hair, her assumption that he would simply comply with her instructions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that made the air in the room feel charged. "There won't be any transfer," Marcus said simply. "My mother will be receiving her surgery here, today, by the best cardiac surgeon you have on staff." Dr. Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign that she'd registered his statement. "I'm afraid that's not possible. As I explained to your mother, Westfield Medical Center has very clear policies regarding uninsured patients. We've already provided emergency stabilization, which is more than most private hospitals would do. Chicago General has an excellent cardiac program and will be able to help her when a spot becomes available." "When a spot becomes available," Marcus repeated, each word precise and measured. "And how long might that be, doctor?" "These things vary," Dr. Thornton replied with practiced evasiveness. "Could be weeks, could be months. The public system handles these cases all the time." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Dr. Thornton the screen. Sarah couldn't see what he was displaying, but she watched the doctor's face change as she read, her composed expression cracking slightly. "I'm Marcus Chen," he said, his voice still conversational. "Perhaps you've heard of Chen Technologies?" The name hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah saw recognition dawn in Dr. Thornton's eyes, followed quickly by calculation. Chen Technologies was one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world, a company whose acquisitions and innovations regularly made headlines in the business world. Marcus had built it from a small startup into a global empire worth billions. "Mr. Chen," Dr. Thornton said, her tone shifting immediately to one of professional deference. "I had no idea. If I'd known about the family connection, we certainly would have approached this situation differently." "Would you?" Marcus asked, and there was something dangerous in his quiet tone. "Because it seems to me that you approached this situation based on what you saw when you looked at my mother, a woman in cleaning clothes without insurance, someone you decided wasn't worth your time or expertise."
Dr. Thornton began to backtrack, her words coming faster as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. "Mr. Chen, please understand, we have protocols that we must follow. Insurance requirements, financial policies, these things exist for good reasons. But of course, for a patient with your family's resources, we can make accommodations." "My family's resources," Marcus repeated, his gaze never leaving Dr. Thornton's face. "Not because my mother is a human being who deserves the best possible care. Not because she spent her entire life working harder than most people in this hospital ever will, but because of my bank account." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. The quiet boy who used to ask her endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how computers worked had become a man who could silence a room with a glance. She could see the power he wielded in the way Dr. Thornton's confidence crumbled, in how the nursing staff had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the electricity of the confrontation. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Dr. Thornton said, her voice taking on the placating tone reserved for very important people who were very unhappy. "Let me assure you that your mother will receive the absolute best care we can provide. I'll personally oversee her treatment, and we can have her in surgery within hours." Marcus's smile was cold enough to freeze water. "Dr. Thornton, I appreciate the offer, but I'm afraid I've lost confidence in your judgment. See, when you looked at my mother, you didn't see someone worth saving. You saw someone disposable, someone whose life mattered less because she couldn't pay your fees up front. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The doctor's face went pale. "Mr. Chen, I understand you're upset, but you have to understand the position we're in. We're a business. We have obligations to our shareholders, our board of directors. We can't simply ignore financial realities." "Financial realities?" Marcus said, pulling out his phone again. "Let me share some financial realities with you, doctor. The call I'm about to make is to my attorney. By tomorrow morning, Chen Technologies will own controlling interest in Westfield Medical Center. Your shareholders, your board of directors, they'll all be answering to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in the machines surrounding her, could see the exact moment when Dr. Thornton realized that her career, her reputation, everything she'd built was now in the hands of the man she'd just dismissed as irrelevant. "That's impossible," Dr. Thornton whispered. "Westfield isn't for sale."
"We're a premier institution. We are backing from some of the most powerful families in Chicago." Marcus was already dialing. "Dr. Thornton, you'd be surprised what's for sale when you have enough money and the right motivation." "Hello, James. It's Marcus. I need you to accelerate the Westfield acquisition we discussed last month. Yes, immediately. I don't care what it costs." Sarah listened to her son orchestrate the hostile takeover of an entire hospital with the same calm efficiency she remembered him using to solve math problems at their kitchen table. He spoke in terms of stock purchases and board positions, leveraging relationships with investment firms whose names she recognized from news reports about billion-dollar deals. Dr. Thornton stood frozen, watching her world crumble in real time. "Mr. Chen, please, there's no need for such extreme measures. I'm sure we can work something out. Your mother will receive the best possible care. I give you my word." "Your word," Marcus said after ending his call, "has already proven to be worthless. You've shown me exactly what your promise means to someone you think is beneath you. Why would I trust it now?" What happened next unfolded with the swift brutality of corporate warfare. Marcus's phone rang constantly as lawyers, investment advisors, and business partners worked to execute his plan. Within 2 hours, Chen Technologies had acquired enough stock and debt to effectively control Westfield Medical Center. Within 4 hours, an emergency board meeting had been called. Within 6 hours, Dr. Victoria Thornton had been relieved of her position as Chief of Cardiac Surgery. Sarah watched it all from her hospital bed, feeling like she was witnessing something from a movie rather than her real life. The woman who had dismissed her so coldly was now begging for a meeting with Marcus, promising to personally oversee Sarah's care if only he would reconsider his actions. The same nurses who had prepared her transfer to the public hospital were now treating her like royalty, checking on her constantly and addressing her as Mrs. Chen with a deference that felt surreal. The most shocking moment came when Marcus called in Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, one of the country's top cardiac surgeons, who flew in from Boston specifically to perform Sarah's surgery. Dr. Morgan was everything Dr. Thornton wasn't: warm and reassuring, treating Sarah with genuine respect and taking the time to explain every aspect of the procedure in terms she could understand. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Morgan said as she reviewed Sarah's charts, "your son has asked me to provide you with the best possible care, but I want you to know that would be my approach regardless of who your family is. Every patient deserves our absolute best effort." The surgery took 8 hours, and Marcus never left the waiting room. Sarah learned later that he'd canceled meetings worth millions of dollars, postponed international conferences, and ignored calls from world leaders just to pace the hospital corridors while she was in the operating room. When Dr. Morgan finally emerged to report that the surgery had been a complete success, Marcus broke down in tears for the first time since he was a child. Recovery took weeks, and Marcus spent most of that time at Sarah's bedside, working from his laptop while she slept and reading to her when she was awake. They talked about everything they'd avoided discussing for years, the distance that had grown between them, the guilt Marcus felt about letting his success separate him from the woman who'd made it all possible. "I was ashamed," Marcus admitted during one of their late-night conversations. "Not of you, never of you, but of myself. I'd convinced myself that acknowledging where I came from would somehow diminish what I'd achieved. I thought if people knew about the tiny apartment and the secondhand clothes and watching you work 3 jobs to keep us afloat, they'd see me differently." Sarah reached for his hand, this brilliant man who'd forgotten that his struggles had been his strength, not his weakness. Marcus, everything you achieved, you earned it. I was never something to be ashamed of. I was the foundation you built everything else on. The transformation of Westfield Medical Center under Chen Technologies' ownership became a model for healthcare reform nationwide. Marcus instituted policies ensuring that no patient would ever be turned away due to inability to pay, created scholarship programs for medical students from low-income backgrounds, and established a patient advocacy system that treated every person who walked through the doors with dignity and respect. Dr. Thornton, meanwhile, found herself blacklisted from every major medical institution in the country. Her dismissal from Westfield became a cautionary tale in medical circles about the dangers of letting personal prejudices override professional ethics. She eventually took a position at a small rural clinic, where she slowly learned that healing had nothing to do with a patient's bank account and everything to do with their humanity. 6 months after Sarah's surgery, Marcus held a press conference at Westfield Medical Center to announce a new initiative providing free cardiac care to uninsured patients throughout the region. Standing beside him at the podium was his mother, healthy and radiant, wearing a dress he'd bought her but that she'd chosen herself, finally comfortable being seen as both the janitor who'd raised a billionaire and the woman who'd earned her son's success through decades of sacrifice. The story spread across social media and news outlets, not as a tale of revenge, but as a reminder that worth isn't measured in dollars, and that the most powerful weapon against discrimination is often simply being seen for who you really are. Sarah received thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories of being dismissed by healthcare systems, of fighting for treatment they couldn't afford, of finding strength in the most unlikely places. Marcus never moved Sarah out of her modest apartment because she didn't want to leave. Instead, he bought the entire building and renovated it, creating affordable housing for working families while ensuring his mother could stay in the neighborhood she loved. He also hired a full-time staff to help her manage the property, but Sarah insisted on keeping her job at the cleaning company, saying that work had always been her pride and she wasn't about to stop now. The relationship between mother and son that had once existed in separate worlds became stronger than ever. Marcus learned to value the lessons his mother had taught him about resilience and compassion, while Sarah discovered that her son's success had never changed his heart, only his understanding of what was possible. Years later, when medical students studied ethics cases, they often discussed the Westfield Medical Center incident as an example of how prejudice and policy can intersect in dangerous ways. But for Sarah and Marcus, it remains simply the day they learned that love doesn't require hiding, that strength comes from acknowledging where you've been, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept that anyone is disposable. The plaque in Westfield Medical Center's lobby reads simply, "In honor of all the invisible people who keep our world running and in memory of the truth that every life has immeasurable value." Below it, in smaller text, it notes that the hospital's patient care policies were established in loving memory of Sarah Williams Chen, the woman who taught her son that wealth means nothing if it doesn't make the world more kind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.